Ethan Carter always believed that a farm wasn't just a piece of land. It was a way of life. A retired military veteran turned innovative small-scale farmer, Ethan devoted his days to restoring not only classic cars, but also to running his electric farm. Nestled on the outskirts of a meticulously maintained suburban enclave, his property, Carter Acres, was a proud testament to independence and hard work. Here, amidst acres of tilled soil, a state-of-the-art electric fence pulsed quietly along the perimeter, serving as both a guardian for his prized livestock and a symbol of his modern approach to age-old traditions. For Ethan, every inch of Carter Acres held memories of his past, the lessons learned on dusty training fields, and the solace of nurturing a land that had once been his escape. The electric fence he installed wasn't merely a deterrent for strays. It was a carefully engineered system, powered by renewable energy and monitored by sensors, ensuring his animals and his property remained safe from intruders. To him, the fence was a blend of technology and tradition, a line drawn firmly between freedom and chaos. But not everyone shared Ethan's vision of autonomy. In the tightly controlled community that bordered his property, the Homeowners Association, HOA, ruled with an iron fist. At the center of this bureaucratic machine was Kerren, the self-appointed queen of conformity and the HOA's president. Kerren prided herself on her immaculate appearance, strict adherence to a Spartan rulebook, and an unwavering belief that every homeowner must conform to her vision of perfection. To her, even an electric fence, no matter how functional or environmentally friendly, was an eyesore and a potential hazard that disrupted the harmonious aesthetic of the neighborhood. The first sparks of conflict ignited one crisp autumn morning. As Ethan methodically inspected his fence, ensuring every sensor and wire was in top condition, he noticed a series of strange footprints near the fence line. At first, he attributed them to local wildlife. However, by mid-morning, a stern envelope was tacked to his barn door. Its embossed header read Community Standards Enforcement, and inside, a notice accused him of installing an unapproved high-voltage deterrent that endangered neighboring properties. The letter, signed by Kerren herself, warned that if Ethan did not immediately remove or modify his electric fence to conform with HOA guidelines, steep fines would follow. Stunned and incensed, Ethan recalled the long hours he had spent researching local zoning laws and property rights, none of which supported the HOA's arbitrary standards. That same afternoon, while working on a restoration project in his garage, Ethan found himself face-to-face with Kerren on his front lawn. With a clipboard clutched tightly in her manicured hand and an expression that brooked no argument, she greeted him. "Ethan Carter," she said coolly, "it has come to our attention that your property is in flagrant violation of our community's safety standards. Your electric fence, as it stands, poses a potential hazard to unsuspecting neighbors and pets." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Kerren, my fence is designed to protect my livestock and secure my land. It's fully compliant with local regulations. I've taken every precaution to ensure it's safe and properly installed." His voice carried equal parts passion and resolve. Kerren's eyes narrowed imperiously. "The HOA's rules are absolute, Mr. Carter. We cannot allow individual interpretations of safety to undermine community standards. Consider this your final warning." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back to her car, leaving Ethan to simmer with indignation and disbelief. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rolling fields of Carter Acres, Ethan sat on his back porch reflecting on the day's events. The electric hum of his fence and the technology that protected his livelihood was now under siege by a self-appointed guardian of suburbia. What began as a technical disagreement had quickly evolved into a battle of wills. One man's right to innovate versus an HOA's relentless insistence on conformity. Determined not to let Kerren's baseless warnings disrupt his way of life, Ethan resolved that he would stand firm for his property rights and for the freedom to run his farm as he saw fit. Little did he know, the events of this autumn day would mark the beginning of an epic showdown, a collision of modern technology, legal rights, and the unyielding spirit of independent living against a tide of arbitrary rules. The very next morning, as dawn broke over Carter Acres, Ethan found another envelope waiting on his doorstep. This time, the document was more ominous. A formally worded notice stating that his electric fence had been deemed hazardous by the HOA, complete with a proposed fine of $750 for violating community aesthetics and safety codes. The letter, replete with legalese and signed off by Kerren herself, left little room for discussion. It was an unmistakable message. The HOA was mobilizing its full bureaucratic might to rein in Ethan's independent ways. Ethan's pulse quickened as he read the notice over his morning coffee. Every line of the document smacked of overreach. Determined not to be bullied, he immediately began reviewing local zoning ordinances and state regulations. His research confirmed what he had long suspected. His electric fence was fully within his rights as a private landowner. Not only did the local codes permit such installations, but they also recognized the need for modern security measures on agricultural properties. As he meticulously compiled copies of relevant statutes and previous rulings on property rights, a sleek, black sedan pulled up alongside his driveway. Two uniformed inspectors stepped out, clipboards in hand, their expressions impassive as they approached the fence. "Mr. Carter," one said in a monotone, "we're here on behalf of the HOA to verify that your installation meets all prescribed community standards." Ethan greeted them with a measured calm. "My fence is fully compliant with local laws. I have all the documentation to prove it." He gestured toward a table set up near the fence, where neatly organized folders and printed regulations awaited review. Kerren soon arrived on the scene, her presence as commanding as ever. With her trademark pastel blazer and a perfectly styled bun, she scanned the property with an air of self-satisfied authority. "Ethan," she intoned, "the rules are the rules. I'm afraid you must either remove this so-called hazard or face the consequences." Her tone left no room for negotiation. Ethan's eyes flickered with controlled anger. "I'm not threatening anyone, Kerren. My fence protects my livestock and ensures the security of my property. It's not causing harm." But Kerren's expression remained unyielding. "The HOA doesn't concern itself with your personal definitions of security, Mr. Carter. We're here to enforce the community's standards, and you are in violation." As the inspectors scribbled notes and took measurements, Ethan's mind raced. This was not just about an electric fence. It was a power play by an organization that sought to dictate every aspect of his life. By midday, with the inspectors departing and Kerren issuing a final cold remark about the inevitability of fines, Ethan resolved that he would fight back. He spent the remainder of the day drafting a detailed rebuttal, citing every pertinent law and regulation. His response was to be submitted to the local zoning office and posted on his property's bulletin board, a public declaration that his rights as a landowner were not up for negotiation. That evening, as the soft hum of his working fence blended with the chirping of crickets, Ethan felt a mix of frustration and resolve. The fine on the envelope was more than just a monetary penalty. It was a symbol of the HOA's attempt to control him. And as Kerren drove off into the twilight, her car's taillights disappearing into the orderly streets of the neighborhood, Ethan knew that the battle lines had been drawn. He was prepared to defend Carter Acres, his innovations, and above all, his independence against a tide of bureaucratic tyranny. In the days that followed, whispers of Ethan's defiance rippled throughout the community. Neighbors who once admired the quiet dignity of Carter Acres began to question whether arbitrary HOA edicts should dictate every aspect of their lives. Meanwhile, Kerren's frustration grew. Determined to stamp out any dissent, she escalated her tactics, initiating a series of even more invasive measures designed to break Ethan's spirit and reassert the HOA's authority. One blustery morning, as Ethan made his routine rounds to inspect his electric fence, he discovered a series of hastily posted notices along the perimeter of his property. Each placard detailed a litany of alleged violations, from excessive electrical output to unsightly wiring, none of which had any basis in fact or law. The notices, adorned with the HOA's official seal, were accompanied by threats of immediate fines and legal action if Ethan did not correct the deficiencies within 72 hours. Ethan's irritation mounted as he took photographs of each notice and gathered evidence. That same day, he learned that a few of his neighbors had begun receiving similar letters, not for issues on their own properties, but for merely living in proximity to his innovative farm setup. Rumors began circulating that Kerren had been pressuring board members to use any pretext to target Ethan, hoping to set an example that would deter others from daring to think outside the rigid confines of the HOA's rulebook. Determined to uncover the full extent of the corruption, Ethan set up discreet cameras along the border of his property. Over the next several days, the footage captured not only repeated instances of the inspector's intrusive visits, but also a series of secretive meetings among HOA board members. In one particularly damning clip, a board member, clearly uncomfortable with the extremity of Kerren's tactics, whispered that funds earmarked for community improvements were instead being diverted to cover legal fees and bolster Kerren's campaign of intimidation. Armed with this evidence, Ethan began compiling a dossier that detailed every instance of overreach. He collected copies of the notices, recordings of the inspector's visits, and even a transcript of a phone conversation in which Kerren brusquely ordered an extra round of fines to be levied against him. Each piece of evidence was meticulously catalogued, ready to be presented as proof that the HOA was less a guardian of community standards and more a tool for personal vendettas. The tension reached a fever pitch at the next scheduled HOA meeting. The meeting hall was packed with anxious homeowners, many of whom had grown weary of Kerren's domineering presence and the endless stream of fines that had begun to choke the neighborhood spirit. With a quiet confidence born of long hours of research and unwavering resolve, Ethan stepped up to the podium. In his hand was a thick folder brimming with incontrovertible evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice steady and clear, "what I'm about to show you is not just about an electric fence or a technicality in community standards. It's about the systematic abuse of power by an organization that has lost sight of its original purpose." One by one, he displayed photographs of the baseless notices, video footage of intrusive inspections, and internal communications that revealed the misappropriation of funds. Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd as the evidence was laid bare. Kerren, seated at the front with a veneer of calm, tried to interject. "These are isolated incidents, Mr. Carter. The rules exist for the benefit of all homeowners." But as Ethan's presentation continued, even some of her staunchest supporters began to shift uneasily in their seats. The mounting evidence painted a picture of an HOA that had become a tool for intimidation, a far cry from the benevolent organization it once claimed to be. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Ethan had struck a nerve. The room was charged with an energy that bordered on rebellion. Homeowners whispered amongst themselves, many now questioning whether Kerren's unyielding enforcement of arbitrary rules was worth the cost of their community's peace. For Ethan, each stolen moment of defiance and every piece of evidence added to his resolve. He wasn't just defending his electric fence. He was standing up for the right to live free from bureaucratic tyranny. As the meeting adjourned in a mix of hopeful murmurs and determined nods, Ethan stepped outside into the cool evening air. The electric fence hummed quietly in the background, a steady, reassuring pulse that symbolized both his livelihood and his unwavering commitment to his rights. The battle was far from over, but with each passing day, the seeds of change were being sown. When the HOA's aggressive tactics began to infringe on every aspect of his life, Ethan knew it was time to push back in a way that no one could ignore. One chilly morning, as he prepared to check on his farm's livestock, he discovered that the situation had escalated beyond mere notices and fines. The power to his entire property had been abruptly shut off, a maintenance emergency, according to a curt note pinned to his front door. The disruption not only endangered his crops and animals, but also threatened to disable the very electric fence that kept his farm secure. Furious yet resolute, Ethan immediately contacted his service provider and local utility company. The investigation revealed that the power cutoff had been orchestrated by the HOA, an act of intimidation designed to force him into compliance with Kerren's ever-shifting demands. This blatant overreach was the final straw. At the next HOA meeting, Held in a stark community center with fluorescent lights and cold, impersonal walls, Ethan arrived armed with his dossier and a plan for retaliation. The room, already charged with the tension of recent events, fell into an expectant silence as Ethan took the stage. With a confident tone that belied the storm raging inside him, he began recounting the string of abuses, the baseless fines, the invasive inspections, the utility cutoff, all culminating in the recent shutdown of power to his farm. He projected images of his darkened property and the ready-made notice on the screen behind him. This, he declared, is not merely a technical issue. It is an assault on my livelihood and on the fundamental rights of every homeowner to enjoy the fruits of their labor without fear of arbitrary punishment. His voice resonated across the hall as he laid out his evidence, piece by piece, showing not only the physical intrusions on his property, but also the internal communications that revealed a disturbing pattern of corruption within the HOA. As Ethan spoke, murmurs of agreement and indignation rippled through the crowd. Neighbors who had long suffered in silence now saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim their autonomy. Even some board members who had previously backed Kerren began to exchange uncertain looks, their loyalty faltering in the face of overwhelming proof. Kerren, for her part, attempted to maintain her composure. Standing at the front of the room, she countered in a measured tone, "Mr. Carter, you are misunderstanding our intention. These actions are necessary to uphold community standards and ensure the safety of all residents." But her words rang hollow against the undeniable evidence of deliberate harassment and abuse of power. With the room now a battlefield of ideals, Ethan laid out his next move. He had arranged for an independent assessment of his property by local authorities, and the initial reports indicated that not only was his electric fence entirely legal, but the HOA's actions constituted a violation of several municipal codes. "This is about accountability," Ethan said. "It's about demanding that our community and our local government stand up for the rights of individuals over the whims of a self-appointed enforcer." By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. What had once been a subdued, controlled gathering of homeowners had transformed into a forum of collective defiance. Neighbors stood up, clapping and nodding in agreement. The energy in the room was palpable, a promise that Kerren's reign of arbitrary control was nearing its end. That night, as Ethan returned to a now power-restored Carter Acres, the hum of his electric fence felt like a heartbeat, a steady rhythm of resistance against tyranny. Every pulse along the fence was a reminder that while Kerren and the HOA might have all the power in their eyes, the spirit of independent living and community resilience could not be so easily extinguished. Cornered by mounting evidence, and a unified community no longer willing to tolerate her overreach, Kerren decided to launch one final desperate maneuver. In a calculated bid to regain control and intimidate Ethan once and for all, she made a call to the local police late one evening. Her report was as dramatic as it was unfounded. Kerren claimed that Ethan's negligent operation of his electric fence was endangering neighboring properties and constituted a public hazard. In her eyes, this was the ultimate power play, a way to force the authorities to intervene and silence his defiance. Within minutes, a patrol car arrived at Carter Acres. Officers, their expressions neutral, made their way toward the property. Ethan, who had been preparing for another long night in his workshop, met them calmly at the gate. "Officers, how can I help you?" he asked, his tone polite yet wary. Kerren's voice crackled over the radio as she attempted to direct the investigation remotely, insisting that the fence was actively harming the neighborhood. As the officers began their inspection, they took careful note of the sophisticated design of Ethan's electric fence. It was clear from their brief discussion with him, and from the documentation he readily provided, that the fence was not only safe, but also installed in full compliance with local regulations. In fact, one officer commented that the entire setup was an excellent example of modern agricultural security. While the investigation unfolded, Ethan maintained his calm and cooperated fully. Unbeknownst to the officers, however, Ethan had already recorded every moment with his hidden cameras, a precaution he'd taken ever since the HOA's harassment began. As the investigation wound down, the officers prepared to close the case, their report finding no evidence of any public hazard. But Kerren wasn't finished. In a moment of bitter desperation, she attempted one final stunt, sneaking onto Ethan's property under cover of darkness to gather additional evidence against him. What she didn't know was that her covert incursion had been caught on Ethan's security cameras. The footage, clear and indisputable, showed Kerren creeping along the edge of the electric fence, tripping a sensor that immediately sent an alert to Ethan's phone. When the officers returned the next morning to follow up on the report, they were presented not with evidence of a hazard on Ethan's property, but with proof of an unauthorized intrusion by none other than Kerren herself. The tables had turned dramatically. Kerren, the perennial enforcer of rules, was now the trespasser. In a swift reversal of fortunes, the officers issued Kerren a trespassing fine, one that came with a stern warning about abusing law enforcement for personal vendettas. At the subsequent HOA meeting, the news of Kerren's misadventure spread like wildfire. Ethan presented the recorded footage to a stunned audience. "This," he declared, "is the culmination of an endless campaign of intimidation and arbitrary rule enforcement. Today, the law has spoken, and it turns out that even those who claim to protect community standards are not above the law." The room erupted in a mixture of gasps and applause. Even longtime supporters of the HOA couldn't help but acknowledge the absurdity of a woman who had called the cops on a perfectly legal electric fence, and then been caught trespassing on her own misguided mission. Kerren's desperate move had not only backfired, it had effectively sealed her fate. As Kerren's face reddened with a mixture of anger and humiliation, the assembled homeowners realized that this was the final straw. Her final, desperate bid for power had exposed her true colors, and the community support was now firmly behind Ethan. In that charged moment, the idea that one person's overreach could dictate the lives of so many was laid bare for all to see. In the wake of Kerren's public humiliation and the mounting evidence of systemic abuse, the community's patience snapped. What began as quiet discontent had transformed into an all-out rebellion against a regime that had long imposed its will through intimidation and arbitrary fines. Over the following weeks, homeowners banded together, organizing meetings, circulating petitions, and rallying around Ethan's call for justice. At an emergency town hall meeting, attended by a record number of residents, the atmosphere was electric with anger and determination. With Ethan's dossier spread out before them, the assembled homeowners listened as he recounted every instance of harassment, every baseless fine, and every overreach perpetrated by the HOA under Kerren's leadership. The evidence was irrefutable. Internal memos, surveillance footage, and first-hand testimonies painted a damning picture of corruption and abuse. When it came time to vote on the fate of the HOA board, the result was swift and decisive. In a historic unanimous vote, the community voted to dissolve the existing board and remove Kerren from her position as president. The vote wasn't just a rejection of one person. It was a declaration that arbitrary authority would no longer be tolerated in their neighborhood. News of the decision spread quickly. Local media picked up the story of garage justice and the remarkable turnaround that saw an overreaching HOA crumble under the weight of its own corruption. City officials launched an independent investigation into the board's practices, and several members found themselves facing hefty fines and even criminal charges for misusing community funds. For Ethan, the victory was bittersweet. While the dissolution of the corrupt HOA was a triumph for personal freedom and community integrity, the battle had come at a personal cost, a cost measured not in dollars, but in the long months of stress and uncertainty. Still, as he sat on his porch one crisp morning, sipping coffee and watching his electric fence hum steadily in the dawn light, he felt a quiet pride. Carter Acres was once again his to manage, free from the arbitrary dictates of a regime that had lost its moral compass. Neighbors who had once cowered behind closed curtains now strolled openly through the community, discussing plans for neighborhood improvements and celebrating their newfound collective voice. The oppressive shadow that had hung over the neighborhood for so long was finally lifting, replaced by a spirit of unity and self-determination. As for Kerren, The collapse of her power was as complete as it was swift. No longer shielded by the HOA's authority, she found herself isolated and under intense scrutiny from both the community and the legal system. Her misadventures, including the notorious incident with the electric fence and her subsequent trespassing fine, became a cautionary tale, a living reminder that tyranny, however small, always invites resistance. In the aftermath of the community's uprising, the full legal ramifications of the HOA's abuses began to unfold. City inspectors and independent auditors were called in to examine the records and financial dealings of the board. What they found was a litany of irregularities, misappropriated funds, unauthorized fines, and rule changes implemented without proper notice or public input. A class action lawsuit was quickly filed by a coalition of affected homeowners, with Ethan's extensive documentation serving as the cornerstone of the case. The legal proceedings were swift and uncompromising. The city imposed heavy fines on the former HOA board, and several members were indicted for fraud and other abuses of power. In a landmark decision, a judge ruled that the board's actions had violated not only local zoning ordinances, but also fundamental property rights, mandating the complete dissolution of the HOA. During a follow-up public hearing, Ethan presented the final verdict, a legally binding settlement that would redirect misappropriated funds toward community improvement projects and ensure that future governance would be transparent and democratically elected. The ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, confirming what many had long suspected, that unchecked authority always carries a heavy price. With the legal hammer falling hard, Kerren's personal world unraveled almost as swiftly as her public persona had collapsed. Once the unassailable enforcer of HOA rules, she now found herself isolated and reviled. The trespassing fine for her own attempted incursion became a symbol of poetic justice, a final public rebuke that no amount of bluster or entitlement could overcome. In the weeks following the verdict, Kerren was forced to resign from any role within the community. Her once pristine reputation was in tatters. Former allies distanced themselves, and whispers of her misdeeds spread through the neighborhood. Even her personal relationships suffered. Rumors abounded that her longtime partner had grown disillusioned by her relentless pursuit of control and had quietly left, unable to reconcile with the woman she had become. Kerren's subsequent attempts to reestablish herself in another community, this time as a low-level property manager for a rival HOA, were met with open derision. At a local job fair, she was spotted by several former neighbors, who exchanged knowing glances and quiet chuckles as she tried to present herself as a reformed enforcer of rules. For many, her fall from grace was complete, a stark lesson in the dangers of unbridled entitlement. Ethan, who had borne the brunt of Kerren's abuse for so long, watched her downfall with a mixture of relief and quiet satisfaction. There was no gloating in his eyes. Rather, it was the measured contentment of a man who had fought for what was right and won. Kerren's personal ruin served as a potent reminder to everyone that even those who claim to stand above the law are not immune to its consequences. As winter gave way to a hopeful spring, the neighborhood began to heal from the long, bitter battle against arbitrary rule enforcement. Carter Acres, once a target of relentless harassment, now shone as a beacon of resilience and independence. Ethan Carter's electric fence, still humming quietly along the perimeter of his land, had become a symbol not of danger, but of defiant innovation, a tangible reminder that individual rights and ingenuity would always triumph over blind conformity. At a relaxed neighborhood block party held on a sunlit afternoon, residents gathered to celebrate the new era of transparency and community self-governance. Laughter and music filled the air as neighbors shared stories of past struggles and toasted to their hard-won freedom. In a light-hearted moment, a longtime friend of Ethan's produced a mock HOA violation notice, accusing him of excessive independence, and the crowd erupted into amused cheers. Ethan, sitting back on his porch with a warm cup of cider and a satisfied smile, watched as the community embraced its newfound spirit. "They really tried," he murmured with gentle amusement, recalling the absurdity of a woman who had once called the cops on his perfectly legal electric fence and ended up with a trespassing fine of her own. In that final tender moment, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with hues of orange and purple, it was clear that the struggle was not just Ethan's alone. It belonged to every resident who had dared to stand up against injustice, who had refused to allow a petty tyrant to dictate the terms of their everyday lives. The screen of memory faded to black as the sound of convivial chatter and gentle music mingled with the rustle of leaves. A final mic drop that declared unequivocally, tyranny, no matter how entrenched, can be dismantled by the united spirit of a community determined to live free. Fade to black.